Hey everybody, this is Ben with Devslopes.com, and in this video we're going to blow your mind with a whole ton of information about the Vector Tile Factory with Mapbox. So what's a vector tile? That's a great question. If we go ahead and press play, we can see them in action on our map. Right here, or rather right there, this whole object that was generated by Mapbox for us is known as a vector tile. This is what contains all of the information about our buildings and any other features that the land there may have. So as you can see, we've got all these individual buildings that's generated by the Vector Tile Factory. Let's stop this and let's go take an in-depth look at this thing. If we click on our map in the project hierarchy, I'm going to drag this over so we can see this really well. We've got a couple of things that we're somewhat familiar with. We've got our image, we've got our terrain, and then we have this vector section. And this is where we control our vector tile factory. We can create them individually if we so choose, but it comes standard along with Mapbox's prefabs. We're going to cover a lot of information here, so just bear with me. The first thing that we see in our vector tile factory is the data source. And what's that? Well, it's the source of the data. The first option that we've got is Mapbox Streets with Building ID, and this is the data source that you're going to choose if you want your player to know what the buildings that they're seeing actually are. It'll have labels and building IDs available with them so that you can go and fetch information about it. There's a reason that we're not using this option for our game. We really want our interface to be as minimal as possible, simple and clean. So adding the extra text by using these building IDs doesn't really add much functionality or value to the game for the player, but it does add noise to our screen and extra data in our network requests. So we're opting to go without the building IDs. Mapbox Streets is just like Mapbox Streets with ID, just, well, without the ID. It provides us with everything that's on top of the ground, so parks, buildings, roads, etc. All of the information for the vector tile is going to come from this data source. The custom is one of the coolest features Mapbox has given us, and it's the ability to provide custom vector tile sources. This means that we can create custom worlds and still utilize the power of Mapbox to render them. Creating these, though, is a little out of scope for this project, so we're not going to go into it too much here. The important thing is that you know that you can create custom map data with the vector file system, and all of the cool stuff that we're going to talk about here with the Vector Tile Factory is still available and applicable to your custom data. At the end of the day, it's just JSON. The next options that we have are the Optimized Style option, and basically what that does is it just minifies our network requests. It takes out anything that is not recognized by Mapbox as a Mapbox style, and that'll cut down on the number of buildings and information that we have come back. And this option of enable coroutines basically says that, in rendering all of these, they can use coroutines. Now let's talk about the reason we're here. The vector layer visualizer. This is one of the most important things to understand about Mapbox in generating your world. It's got a ton of features, it's super powerful, and I'm really impressed by this. So let's click on our existing visualizer, the buildings, and let's see what's inside. So the first thing that we see is whether or not this visualizer is active. We can update this on the fly, or we can change it before we even run our game. And just like any other game object, it'll either turn it on or off. The primitive type of a vector layer visualizer is pretty important to understand because vector data is made up of lines, polygons, points, or custom data. And basically what that means is when we select a primitive type, we're telling Mapbox what we're looking for. So if we click this dropdown, you'll see point, line, polygon, and custom, like I just mentioned. And basically the purposes of these are polygons are there for things that have shape, that'll have a model behind them, really. This is going to be stuff like buildings or parks or that kind of thing. Parking lots. Roads are going to be lines because they're going from one point to another. And points are just spots on the map. So depending on what we choose, there are a whole bunch of different options, but the ones that we're going to be working with most frequently are polygons, because we're controlling buildings and other land features. And I know I keep talking about it, but custom is another way that Mapbox allows us to customize our data. It gives us a primitive type that we can optionally select, so we can build our own custom vector types and target them with this setting. Then we've got the layer name, and that name refers to the layer that you're targeting. If you remember when we were looking at Mapbox Studio, we talked about buildings, land use, that kind of stuff. That's where this comes into play. You can easily find these keys in Mapbox Studio or in Mapbox's documentation, but just know that that's how that works. That's how we select what we're looking for. Snap to terrain allows us to decide whether or not we want these buildings or whatever's being generated by the layer visualizer to snap to our terrain factories result. So if you want your buildings to be right on the land the way that they are in real life, then go ahead and snap to terrain. That's going to be the most common selection. Or we can uncheck this box and we can actually populate buildings and such above the land, which again is kind of cool. Group features decides whether or not we are creating one object out of the results of this layer visualizer for the tiles that it generates. So this is a great way to optimize your game and save a lot of processing power. If you don't need, for example, all of the buildings in a tile to be their own separate object, then you can definitely group the features, and it'll save a lot of processing power on Unity and, in the end, your player's device. The less Unity has to keep track of, the better your game is going to perform. So if you need access to all of those individual buildings, then definitely leave this off. Otherwise, it's a great thing to consider. One of my absolute favorite features of Mapbox is this right here, the collider type. We can dynamically assign colliders to each of these objects that are being generated. You've just got your typical options, but this is still really cool. You've got box, mesh, or sphere. And the point of this is, as it's generating, again, buildings, because that's a great example, you can assign a box collider to it, and then you don't have to worry about finding it anywhere. We can handle it with some scripts, which I'll show you how to do here in just a bit. Next, we've got the extrusion height. And I briefly covered this before, but in a little more detail, we've got the property height, which is the actual size of the building in relation to the world scale. We've got a minimum height, and this is going to make it so that if a building is shorter than the minimum, it'll bump it up to that height. Otherwise, it'll go off property. Max is the same, but the opposite. If it's over a certain height, then it'll cap it off. Otherwise, it defaults to the property height. And range height is really cool. It allows us to clamp a height between the two. So, say for example, you wanted your buildings to be between 30 and 60 units high in Unity. You could clamp it, and anything that's below the 30 will jump up to 30. Anything above 60 will drop down to 60. Otherwise, it goes off property. And absolute height is the option we're using for our game right now. And we just set one height for each building. It doesn't matter what its actual height is. And then with the geometry types, we can select whether we want the whole object or just the roof or just the side, and decide how much of that we actually want. Another great way that Mapbox allows us to customize what happens with our map data is through these material options. We can assign materials to the entire group of objects, so all of them are going to follow whatever texture we set here, whatever material we choose. And you've got some options for that of tiled, satellite, atlas, or atlas with a color palette. And Mapbox has provided a whole bunch of materials. Mapbox has provided a bunch of materials for us, so play around with those, get inspired, and get excited about it. At this point, I know your mind is blown. You're saying, Ben, this couldn't possibly get better. But I'm here to tell you it can. Now that we've covered the basics, we're going to look at arguably the three most important parts of the Mapbox Vector Layer Visualizer. First, we've got filters. These filters allow us to put in keys and a value, and then choose how we want it to interact with our world. What do I mean by that? Well, we can pick Again, a key such as type. So we can type in type here, and then type in hospital. And now, because my operator is contains, and my combiner is either any or all, if the building in question is a hospital, it'll render, otherwise it won't. And I can add another new filter, and I can say school. Well, now I've got the type and hospital and school. Both of them should contain, and we want it to match any of them. So with this selected, if it's a hospital or a school, it'll render. If I select all, it would need to be a hospital and a school for it to come back and render onto our scene. And if I pick none, then I'm going to get everything except for hospitals and schools. Let's remove those filters. But you might be asking the question, why do I care? Well, for starters, Mapbox strongly encourages us to use the filters to save on data usage. And it's a really good idea to get as specific as possible on the game side of things. Fewer results means fewer objects your player's device has to handle at runtime, fewer results that come back from the network request, and overall better data and a better experience. So use the filters, get specific, and more importantly, this will become a huge player when we go to look at points of interest. Because that's how we'll fetch them, is we want specific, filtered down results. Next, we've got our modifier options. And we can change the feature position, which is basically just going to order where stuff appears on our tile, whether that's at the tile center, at the first vertex, or at the center of the vertices. Now for the other big two. Mesh modifiers are really cool. Using mesh modifiers, we can directly manipulate the mesh of the game object as it's created. We can customize the look and feel of Mapbox generated objects as they come in. Think of it like adding an extra step in the factory to add a fresh coat of paint to your building before shipping it out for use in your game. We can change just about anything on that object using this option. The last one that we want to talk about is my absolute favorite part of the Mapbox SDK, period. Why is this so amazing? Well, we can change just about anything on the game objects created from this visualizer. Think about it for just a second. In Pocket Droids Go, it's maybe not so important, but say, for example, we were creating a game where we had enemy tanks appearing on the screen shooting paint at buildings. The game object modifier allows us to modify anything about, well, almost anything about the game object as it's created from this factory. So we can add tags, we can assign scripts, we can assign these objects to a collection, you name it, and you can probably adjust it. And setting this up really couldn't be easier. All we have to do is go to our project, and the same way that we would create anything else, I can right-click on a folder, or even just in the project root. Go to Create, go to Mapbox, and then go and hover over their Modifiers section. And anything in this list, we can create a modifier for. Some of them are mesh modifiers, but we've got things like Add Mono Behaviors modifier, where we can add as many scripts as we want to these objects. We can add to collection, we can update their collider, we can add feature behaviors, adjust their layer, add tags. Again, this is a really important part of the SDK. It's a super powerful tool, and I'd strongly suggest getting used to using it. It'll just make your games that much better. With that, we've taken the full tour of the Vector Factory in Mapbox's SDK. I know that a lot of this probably sounds complicated, but as we practice with it and get used to using it, and you see it in action here shortly, you'll really understand it, and you'll understand that this is where a huge amount of the power of the Mapbox SDK for Unity comes from. And really, it gives us the freedom to create just about anything we want using their tools. So great job listening and following along. Hopefully you understood some of why this tool is so important, and I'm excited to show you how to use it in a real example. This is Ben with Devslopes.com, and we'll see you next time.